So I'm going to go to Terry Westerway. Go ahead.
Okay. Australia is in debt up to its eyebrows. We've got no possibility of paying it off anywhere within the foreseeable future. The refugees that we get are, well, not likely to be, they are likely to be welfare dependent for a long time into the future, if not permanently. Where are we to get the money and the resources to look after the current refugees and any future refugees?
All right, we'll start with you.
Terry, thank you.
Taxes lately?
Thank you for that assessment. Look, clearly when you read some of the reports, there are refugees, like every segment of the population, who have either temporary or on a medium-term basis dependent on some welfare. But certainly the people I come across, and whether it's my family or extended family, I don't think our family has ever taken one welfare check, to be honest. When we first came, Mum and Dad found a job straight away, straight after the initial settlement, and they've been working in a factory for the last 30 years. And then, I've been involved in starting 3 businesses and others, and created jobs. And yes, you might say, okay, well, that was one segment of the refugees that came from, Chinese background. I'm now involved in another organisation that some colleagues and I've started, where we're creating loans to refugees to start businesses. And recently I went out and visited 6 businesses that have all started by refugees that have arrived in the last 3 or 4 years. And I've got to say that the work ethic and the motivation to actually get ahead and come off any dependence on welfare is probably, exceptional. These people working, 15, 16-hour days, 6, 7 days a week, starting businesses and actually creating jobs. So far from perhaps being a long-term drain on Australia's budget expenditure, I think there's lots of evidence to just suggest that certainly, if not in the immediate generation, then certainly in the next generation, that the GDP is a net positive GDP contributor. But the point, I think, if I may jump on another point that is related to something you said, where there's no question, leaving aside the UNHCR or the Refugee Convention, I think generally across the first world, we do have an issue at the moment about our goodwill around how many displaced people and refugees that countries are willing to take in. And there is, concerns around debt levels, terrorism. There's a whole range of things that's making things quite complicated out there at the moment. There's one example I'd like to refer the panel and the audience to, which is the Canadian experience, where they've got a program where private individuals can privately sponsor refugees. Now that's local sporting teams or families or community groups that get together. And in the Canadian experience, 27,000 Canadian dollars will sponsor a family of refugees in, and you're responsible for the first year's accommodation, food, and medical needs of that family.
So you reckon that would work in Australia?
I absolutely think it would work in Australia. But what it does take is government policy settings to enable that to happen. Now, Australia's running a small pilot of that, which is different to the Canadian experience, but it's nonetheless allows sponsor organisations like AIMS and SSI to help refugees sponsor and bring in extended families. But it's quite different because you're paying for $30,000 of application fee, but once the extended family arrives, it's still back onto the government responsibility for the settlement program. The difference, and I think the magical thing about what the Canadians have done, is by broadening out the private sponsorship to all different segments of the community. You have you dealing with a culture of welcome rather than one where it's pushing people away. You're actually engaging refugees in the same way that, you know, I don't know, families who've hosted international students on the Rotary program, they're in your house.
Let me just quickly interrupt. I want to just go back to Terry, who asked the question. Listen to that, Terry. Do you think that sort of thing could work here? Would that sort of satisfy your problem, that people are a burden?
I think you're talking about small potatoes. You're not talking about the billions and possibly trillions of dollars that we're already in debt. Where are we going to discharge? You've got to discharge the debt we have in the first place.
Terry, the $10 billion we've just spent on southern borders and the current, that is a significant amount of money that will continue to have to be spent year in, year out if we're going to maintain this policy.
OK, Hugh, I'm going to go to Jane. She was nodding here, and I just want to hear quickly what she says. We're going to go to other questions as well.
I think one of the misunderstandings is somehow that there's a fixed pie of wealth and that it has to be divided up more and more the more people we have. That's not true at all. The more people there are, the bigger the pie becomes. And that is borne out in all the research studies that have been done, going back 30 years or more in Australia, which show that certainly when the first refugees arrive, they might need a little bit more support and assistance. But by the second generation, their kids are outperforming Australians on so many measures, including education. Levels are higher than Australians and other migrants. Very often paid work and voluntary work as well, scoring well above comparable cohorts. In Sweden, what's fascinating, Sweden has been the country per capita to take the largest number of refugees in Europe. And what they found is that even in the short term, their economy has grown by 4.5%. Uganda, fantastic examples of refugees creating businesses, creating employment for locals as well as others. So this idea that somehow refugees are welfare dependent and are a drain on the economy is just not borne out in any of the evidence we have. The IMF has said, you know, the current refugee movement into Europe is a very positive thing in terms of the economic benefit it will have over time.
All right, well.